All right, moving on, we will be having our third panel on governance and ethics in AI. What is Singapore doing in managing the safe and proper use of AI technologies? Okay, so here from a stellar panel of expert speakers whom I will be inviting up on stage shortly. First up, we'd like to have the moderator, Professor Simon Chesterman, Senior Director of AI Governance AI Singapore, up on stage. Let's give him a round of applause, please. And panelists, Rachel Teo, Head of Public Policy, Singapore and Southeast Asia, Google. And next, Dr. Ming Tan, Founding Executive Director, Tech for Good Institute. And lastly, Lee Wan-si, Director of Data-Driven Tech Infocomm Media Development Authority. Let's welcome them up on stage, and now leave this to the moderator to kickstart the session.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for sticking with us. I think some people might be taking a bio break or a coffee break and coming back in. But this is one of the challenging slots straight after lunch when the glucose levels are going up and down. I was once doing an event like this, and a gentleman sitting right about where that man in the white shirt is fell asleep. Now that occasionally happens. It wasn't this gentleman, I assure you, but he started to snore quite volubly to the point where it disrupted the meeting, and I said to the woman sitting next to him, who was not that woman, "Sorry, can you tap him on the shoulder, please? It's disrupting the event." She glared at me and she said, "You put him to sleep, you wake him up." So I'm sure that won't apply to this group today because we've got a really exciting topic and a wonderful panel to discuss it. So following on from the previous discussions you've had through the day, and indeed if you've been at the industry fair downstairs or attending other events, you're all aware that there is tremendous potential in the area of artificial intelligence. There are also risks and challenges, and what we're going to be talking about in this panel is how to balance those things. There's a lot of activity. Clearly, Singapore is very active in this space. We've recently committed to deepen our strategic technology partnership with the United States. In the United States itself, in celebration of this panel, President Biden issued a new executive order. There's a conference on AI safety that Rishi Sunak organised also just to compete with this panel. The EU's AI Act is, of course, on the way. China is developing its own regulatory framework. But one of the challenges we sometimes confront, particularly talking with innovators and entrepreneurs, and I say this as the former dean of a law school, is people don't really like talking to lawyers. And for a startup, often the lawyer is the last person you want to speak to. And that's partly because it's a cost, partly because sometimes the lawyer determines that he or she should just be the minister of no, telling you what you can't do. But hopefully what we'll do today is explain how governance and ethics can help innovators achieve what they want to achieve, do what they need to do, while managing risk in an appropriate way. And a good lawyer can do more than just help you achieve what you want to achieve. They can help you do it in a way that's going to be sustainable, in a way that's going to be protected. So I've got an outstanding panel to help us talk through the current environment and what Singapore is doing to help manage the environment for users, while also encouraging innovation from people like everyone who's in the room today. We've got representatives from government, from industry, from think tanks. And so I've got a huge clock down here telling me how much time I'm wasting. So rather than giving you an elaborate introduction, you can Google them if you like. I think Rachel would like that. You can Google them for more information, but I will just tell you that we've got Rachel Teo from Google, representing, if you like, team industry. We've got Ming Tan from the Tech for Good Institute, representing the think tank world, and Wan-si from IMDA, Singapore's Infocomm Media Development Authority, representing, if you like, government. And I'll start with Wan-si. Wan-si, IMDA's mission is to drive Singapore's digital transformation by building a vibrant digital economy and an inclusive digital society. Can you maybe speak to the room and the innovators here about how innovators should think about governance and ethics, when they should think about it, and what tools are available to make it just a little bit easier to navigate?
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me on the panel, and very happy to be here. Just as people don't want to talk to lawyers, I think people also do not want to talk to government officials. So this is a good opportunity for me to just anyway share what we're doing. So to answer the question, maybe I just Well, I mean, to speak to the innovators in the room, first, when you think about governance, you shouldn't think about compliance. It's not really about just a compliance problem, right? That's something that's necessary hops that you have to jump through. But first think about why is it that you need to build trust, and why is it that you need to do or implement AI in a responsible way. It's really about getting more customers. It's really about building good brands, right, for your products and your services. So start from that, and then think about then what is it that you stand for. Is it about helping your customers understand where AI is used in the delivery of the services, in the products, and so on? What are some of the things that you have to be more transparent about in offering more information, for example? So start thinking about what are some of the principles that you want to stand for as an organization, and then you start thinking about then how do you want to execute and implement that. And of course, from the government perspective, there are many ways in which we are trying to be helpful and trying to be supportive. The Singapore government, I get asked this a lot, so I'll just put it out there. The US has put out the executive order just yesterday or day before yesterday. As Simon mentioned, the EU is in the midst of coming to an agreement or negotiating on the EU AI Act. There's a lot of discussion in the UK, primarily on frontier models, so maybe slightly less relevant to the audience in this room. But really for Singapore, it's really about how then do we be practical and supportive of the industry to implement responsible AI, right? And we put out a lot of guidelines, recommendations, we bring the industry together. But one of the things that you can think about is, as you implement your system, how then do you show your customers that your system is aligned to trustworthy AI principles, right? That's where AI Verify, for example, comes in. It is a toolkit and a framework for testing AI products or AI systems to show where you are with regards to specific principles like robustness, explainability, fairness, and so on. And reports are generated that you can show your key stakeholders. Could be your board, could be your customers, and so on. So that's a toolkit that we're very happy to have put out there in the world. It's actually currently just a minimum viable product because really the sciences of AI testing is still developing. That's why we've open sourced it. Feel free to download it from GitHub, Google AI Verify, and you'll be able to find the AI Verify Foundation website, and then you can go to GitHub and download the toolkit. It's open source, you can look at it, play with it. At the same time, we also invite all of you to participate in or join AI Verify Foundation to contribute to the development of testing tools and capabilities, as well as share knowledge in how you can use testing tools or use AI or implement trustworthy AI in an effective way. So I'll just stop here for now because I think the clock is also counting down. But if I have a chance later, I'll talk a little bit about what we are thinking of in Gen AI, which is maybe something that's more interesting or quite interesting for the audience in this room. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Wansi. And I think that key message that Singapore is really trying to navigate that space of not under-regulating the sector, but not over-regulating it either. And then in particular, offering additional assistance. So I think the effort that we've seen in the data protection space, now in the AI space, to offer support for companies. So AI Verify really is not about sort of policing artificial intelligence, it's rather giving companies tools to monitor their own compliance, to see whether you're upholding your own standards. And that's important for startups, but it's also important for established ventures. So Rachel, Google was once a startup. I assume you weren't involved in Google then, you probably weren't even born. But as an established player, Google, I think, really does recognize the importance of not just having cool products, but having people trust you as well as those products. So Google did previously have, I don't think it sticks by the motto now, don't be evil, although I always thought that was a much better motto than move fast and break things, which seems like a recipe for mistakes. But this week, you launched a new iteration of your report on the digital economy. Can you speak a bit from your perspective about how to build in principles and foster trust in this fast-moving environment?
Thanks, Simon. Great to be here, chatting with all of you. Not as young as I look. Asians don't age very much, just like suddenly accelerate into old age. But maybe if I could
Sorry,
speak
so you're
first.
saying I look old. Thank you very much.
But in the don't be evil way, I'm not gonna follow on that comment. But maybe picking on the don't be evil part, actually what is probably lesser known to a lot of people in the audience is that we operate on the basis of three respects, and I'll come to how I tie that to what you asked, Simon. So one is respect the opportunity, respect the user, and to respect each other. And it's actually the first thing that you get told when you go for any orientation. And how I want to link it to what we are talking about today is that just literally 2 hours ago, the embargo for the 8th edition of our Google Temasek Bain Southeast Asia Economy Report was launched. In this report, we see that Southeast Asia has actually performed quite well and relatively resilient considering the macroeconomic headwinds. The region has grown 11% in gross merchandise value to reach $218 billion this year, and we continue that resilient trajectory to continue. That said, most firms, and you would also be familiar with that, are focused heavily on profitability now and less so on just sort of user adoption. And in light of that chase for profitability, there is a worry that individuals will get left behind. So how do we focus on respecting the user and in over-indexing on digital inclusion, which Ming would speak to later and is the expert here on this. I would say that from a Google perspective, AI is embedded in all our products. Everything from Gmail, the fact that 99.9% of all phishing and malware is kept out of your inbox before it even hits that. A lot of it is unseen. And we take very deliberate efforts to debias our training data so that in things like Google Translate, if you put in things like X is a doctor, it doesn't automatically translate to he is a doctor just because of the nature of the training data, but we debias it to be he, she is a doctor, so we don't entrench stereotypes. All this is the actual manifestation of our AI principles, which we launched in 2018. This unpacks a lot of basically the ethical boundaries of what we would do or not do in our AI. So things, for example, that we would not do would be to engage in AI that has a greater probability of causing harm or with the intent to cause injury, for example. So it's these principles that we rely on for the rigorous debate as we think about launching and the life cycle of a product. And maybe the last piece that I'll end on here is that these principles manifest themselves into structures and processes and committees that take place at different levels within the organization. At the very basic level, when we think in our product area, which is kind of BU, if you will, in more common parlance, these principles form the checklist of what we need to go through before we think about launching new products or features. And then in the instance where we cannot agree on what to do or not, then there are escalation pathways to resolve some of these sort of more ethical dilemmas within AI governance. So back to you, Simon.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges in this space, which is that, I mean, in much of life, most regulation actually happens at the individual or the organization level. I mean, governments have a role to play, but most regulation is actually self-regulation. The reason why most people don't break the law is not that they're worried about the police catching them, sending them to prison, it's they choose not to break the law. And one challenge in this space is that for an established player like Google, you've got like a reputation to maintain. For some startups, one of the questions that comes up in this area is whether they're more willing to take risks. So in the area of facial recognition, for example, I know Google had technology, some other companies had technology, and then it was Clearview.ai that came out and rolled that technology out more quickly. And so maybe that's something we'll come back to, is the evolution of thinking in small organizations as they become more established. But as you said, there's a huge amount of potential in this space, and I think particularly in the region of Southeast Asia, one question is not just how big the pie is, but how it's going to be distributed. So Ming, can I turn to you from your TFGI perspective? So TFGI has done a lot of work looking at digital inclusion across Southeast Asia, where there's huge potential for growth and for transforming millions of people's lives. The challenge, or one of the challenges, is it's an incredibly diverse region and one that's changing really quickly. Could you speak a bit to how that should affect the way people think about governance and ethics as they enter this sort of broader Southeast Asian market?
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here and for AIMX for bringing a little non-profit organization to the table between government and industry. When I was in the Philippines just last month, one of the policymakers says, you know, for this space like AI, we need magic. And I'm like, well, magic isn't going to happen, right? He says, no, magic is making academia, government, and industry collaborate. So that's a good thing to remember. So we are very quickly, the Tech for Good Institute is a small non-profit organization. We are focused exclusively on Southeast Asia, on the issues of the digital economy and how it impacts both the economy as well as society. And we want to bring together such collaborative efforts like magic for sustainable, inclusive, and equitable growth for the region. Quite interestingly, the Tech for Good Institute conducted a series of roundtables in the first quarter of this year, funded by IMDA, thank you, Wansi, across Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And we wanted to find out from stakeholders across the ecosystem, i.e. industry, academics, policymakers, in each of these countries about what's the future trajectory of the digital economy. And, ChatGPT had just launched about a couple months ago. And across 130 of these participants, the common concern was how do you enable good governance in emerging technologies and in the deployment of emerging technologies when you don't really know what its capabilities are, but really for the purposes not of control, but to be able to foster trust in the digital ecosystem. The idea is that, the digital technologies and digital transformation has that potential to actually help Southeast Asia leapfrog forward. But if you lose trust in the digital ecosystem, then a lot of that potential is just going to be an uphill battle. So, we've also done some work on trust at the Tech for Good Institute. And it's pretty interesting because we found that one's propensity to trust technology does not translate into one's propensity to trust the services enabled by those technologies. And that this piece of research was based on digital financial services specifically, but I think we can translate that insight to today's conversation. The consistent predictor of trust across Southeast Asia is the perception of a service provider's integrity. When you talk about respect, right? Respect the user, respect the opportunity. Does the provider, be it a government agency or a company, a big company, a small company, do they have a strong sense of social justice? Do they have sound principles that translate into action and behavior? That predicts trust in the services and also adoption. So what I basically mean is that process matters as much as the product. And they feel, trust is built when users feel like the process has been safe and at the forefront of developers' minds from the outset and from the get-go. That's why AI Verify is so important. And the issue is that there are glaring asymmetries between the big companies and the small companies, between industry, where a lot of data AI research is being done, and government, and also between countries across Southeast Asia. So there's great appetite for such multi-stakeholder conversations, open, transparent knowledge sharing. The other issue I want to bring is that when we think about governance of AI, we think it's one thing or one technology, and it really isn't. Good governance of AI also relies on basic governance of tech policy in general. And if you just take something like data protection, every jurisdiction in Southeast Asia is kind of on a different path. If you look at Malaysia, you look at Philippines, you look at Singapore, we have had data protection legislation for about 10 years or more, right? Indonesia and Vietnam only put in data protection regulation in the last 2 years. So everyone's at this different point. So if you think about that as data protection, which is pretty basic, AI governance is going to also progress at a different level. And I think maybe the last angle that I want to bring when it comes to Southeast Asia, and maybe something useful for the companies here, is that I often bring up this point, and it's something which makes everyone go, which is 100 million of the 460 million internet users in Southeast Asia, almost a quarter, right, only came on board into the digital world over the last 3 years because of the pandemic. And usually when I use this stat, it's to show, look, we're a mobile-first community, right? We're mobile native and we're mobile only. So you've got to develop your products and your customer journeys to that. But for today's conversation, they are also, in a way, AI native. Sort of recommendation engines, chatbots, machine translation. That's all like normal. They don't really know a world before that. And so what's really important on this inclusive issue is the importance that the definition of digital literacy and the investment in digital literacy for the consumers and the users really has to change to include AI literacy. right? How do you recognize when, Wansi, we just had this conversation, right? How do you recognize AI-generated content? How do you think critically about the answers which are coming back to you? How do you maintain autonomy in decisions and as well as responsibility for your decisions, even if it is supported with AI? So to sum up, yes, Simon, Southeast Asia is a really fast-changing world. It's very exciting. It is diverse, and so that is always going to be a challenge for companies who are looking to come into Southeast Asia, but the opportunity is also massive, and we have to be able to make magic, work at the regional level, work at the national level, work at the industry level, and across each of these layers to make that ecosystem happen.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, so we do have a Slido thing. A couple of people have put in questions. I'm going to ask one more question maybe to each, and then we'll go to the Q&A. I should say to the people at the back, if you're trying to get your steps in and you want to stand up, that's fine. If you would like to sit down, please do come and take a seat. I promise not to cold call on this class. But to the point you were making, Ming, about trust in particular, I'm reminded of sort of the line from Warren Buffett that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 20 minutes to lose it. And so maybe, Rachel, can I come back to you and Wansi? In these environments, we tend to focus on good examples and hold ourselves forward, and Google and Singapore, I think, are doing pretty well in this space. But we can also learn a lot from bad examples. I had a colleague I used to teach with who would always tell students, don't worry, no one's completely useless. You can always be a bad example. So not asking you to refer to yourselves, but can you give me or think of an example of a mistake or a bad policy or a bad approach that a government or a corporation has taken that we might learn from in the context of navigating this space? Whether it's companies that were too averse, and occasionally sort of Kodak gets held up here, although there's an interesting analysis of Kodak. People sometimes think Kodak wasn't interested in going digital. It was interested in going digital, but it had the wrong business model because it thought that digital meant people would print lots of digital photos, and that was the flaw. Or governments, this question of whether countries are over-regulating or under-regulating. So that's enough think time for you, Rachel and Wansi, and then I'll come back to Ming with a different question. But Rachel, something we can learn from in terms of a mistake.
You more think time. Thanks, Simon. Always the easy questions, clearly. I'm trying to find a good answer to thread that needle, but maybe if I could offer two perspectives from my vantage point, and just bearing in mind that this is still sort of a very evolving and live discussion for us. So obviously the one challenge that we faced earlier in this year was that, Google has been doing AI for forever, right? But ChatGPT pretty much snooked us, right? You could argue that from all the headlines and also everyone who's quoting LLMs, ChatGPT is the first thing that comes to mind. The question is, where's Bard? Where's Google in this mix? And I would say that, because we've been so thoughtful about it, one could argue, and I think this game is still playing out now, right? One could argue that we're a bit late to launch. I think that we do a lot of soul searching around, the processes that needed to have changed for us to have been more nimble, because it really accelerated and precipitated, I would say, a galvanizing, and now you see Gen AI in all our products, and it is truly quite magical. But one could argue that being overly cautious was not great for our business and certainly stock price at the time. So that's one lesson that I would say has made us reflect around the agility of our processes to launch fast in a bold and responsible way. That's one. The second piece that has been really occupying my days and nights, to be honest, and I don't think it's a solved problem by any means, is that for all the opportunity that AI presents, there's also the fact that it is democratizing AI tools for bad actors, including in cybercrime, financial fraud, and all of that. So it is not a solved problem, as I said, and I think that it remains a bit of a whack-a-mole, but we continue to invest heavily, like the conversation in the UK on AI safety happening today, is really about how we manage extreme risks in AI through partnerships with governments to enhance trust in the system, drive trust marks around AI systems and tools, but also use AI to prevent disinformation campaigns, cybercrime and fraud, and detect those earlier through other intelligence signals. So we work very closely with our Mandian teams, for example, to pick up those signals and make sure that those are in our products to keep our networks and ultimately all of us safe. So not a solved problem, but I would say if you ask me around like where we need to continue to be vigilant, like that second one is certainly what preoccupies my waking hours heavily.
Yeah, and there's already one question at least talking about deep fakes, and I think that is something we'll come back to. And it's a dilemma. I mean, as we sort of said, you don't want to be too slow that you miss out, but if you rush, that's when you make mistakes. And that whole move fast and break things, I think if we look at the history of social media, one reason why we're having all these debates about artificial intelligence and governance now is realizing if you could go back in time to 2004, maybe we would have done things a little bit differently. Maybe we wouldn't have had so much teenage anxiety and depression, the Cambridge Analytica scandal in the United States, and so on. Wansi, what about governments that have made mistakes? Feel free to name names if you like.
I feel like I'm being baited to talk about, talk bad about my colleagues in other governments, so I shall not do that. But maybe just citing a couple of examples of where I think we could have better understanding of the problem at hand. So number one, I think AI governance AI governance is not monolithic, right? It's not one thing. And if you think about what's happening in terms of the conversations that have started this year, just this year, when ChatGPT, sort of caught the public's imagination and the use of Gen AI has increased dramatically, we started seeing all these conversations around, just to pick up on Rachel's point, AI is going to take over the world and kill everybody, right? So that's one, humanity is going to die as a result of that. And then some other people will say, no, that's not going to happen, right? And don't waste time talking about that. We have more immediate issues around bias, around, robustness, and so on of current AI systems that to worry about. And there's a lot of this back and fro and a lot of debate and a lot of discussions around which is right and which is wrong. But actually, it's not just one thing, right? There are things that you need to worry about in the long term, and that's where the AI Safety Summit in UK is happening. The thinking about frontier issues that are happening when models become more capable. Not whether they will take over the world, whether they'll be sentient and so on, but as they become more capable, how then do you deal with dual use issues? How do you deal with people using it for cybersecurity crimes? How do you deal with people becoming a lot more dependent on them because they're so capable that you don't have to worry about thinking for yourself anymore and so on. Right, so those are frontier issues, addressing capabilities. I think we need collectively as a world to come together, as humanity come together to think about some of these issues and how do we work together to address some of these risks. Then there are also more near-term things, right? We are already using Gen AI in our everyday lives, right? People are embedding these tools or embedding Gen AI models and capabilities in their existing tools and products. Then how do you address the immediate risks, immediate harms, and so on? Harms around hallucinations, for example. Harms around even embedded biases and toxicity in the model output, for example. So these are things that you have to worry about already today. And it's not something that you can then choose one or the other. I think we have to work together. And for the immediate harms, I think that's where domestically there are, or rather in each national agenda, there's something they have to concern themselves over, because every culture is different. Even if the data is collected from the internet for training, right? The output may be okay for one culture, but not okay for another. That's why I think yesterday, I'm going to pitch my work. We launched the Gen AI Evaluation Sandbox. That's one way in which we are thinking about how then do we help, right? Not just about evaluating frontier models, not just about evaluating models across the board, but evaluating for context-specific use cases, culture-specific, use case-specific, because these are things that when it comes down to use, the model developers will not be thinking about. But people who are deploying these models, who are using these models down the supply chain, will have to think about. So how then do we build better products? And that's where the evaluation of models become important. And we're helping to then contribute to that space, working with Google, as well as a lot of other partners, to build up capabilities in evaluation. Because only when you know how they perform, then can you address the issues that are embedded in the models, either through better training, fine-tuning, or even then putting in place capabilities from an application engineering perspective to deal with that. So that's really just one way in which you can sort of steer away from all these competition and disagreements over what to focus on, because we all have different things that we need to look at, and we can all play our part, right? In this world of AI governance, there's so many things to do.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as we were discussing before the panel, there are so many processes going on underway at the moment that it's very hard for a small country like Singapore to be taking part in all of them. So you do need to be a little bit strategic. And I do think one of the smart things Singapore's done is not focus on reinventing wheels, but looking at where you have to come up with all the new guidelines, frameworks, principles, but rather looking at how you apply them in practice in the specific context. And that kind of brings us back to diversity. And so Ming, if I can pick up that point with you, you mentioned diversity, and that raised the question of who's represented in this context. A lot of the training data is global, which means, candidly, a lot of it's American. And there's a really interesting challenge that one sees we're looking at in the generative AI context, how we make things local to a Singapore context, or indeed just to the traditional sort of transatlantic debate when an American says, oh, that's quite good, and an English person says that's quite good. They mean very different things. So Ming, in the context of Southeast Asia, could you talk a bit more about the challenges that diversity poses for AI developers and deployers in a region like this, and whether that creates opportunities as well?
Sure, thank you so much. I mean, once you mentioned large language models, and I'll just use that as an example, right? We know that many of today's models are based on data that's scraped from the web, but 60% of all web content is in English. And we live in a region where if we took a flight 1 hour in any direction from Singapore, we could be in contact with over 100 different ethnicities, and we speak over 1,000 different languages in this region. Mozilla's Internet Health Report 2002 found that half of the data sets in the world are produced from just 12 elite institutions, and no prizes for guessing whether or not these 12 elite institutions come from Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, they don't. They're in the United States, they're in Europe, and they're in Hong Kong. So if left unchecked, there is a real risk that real-world inequality and historical biases are basically perpetuated in the digital space. So, you know, Wansi, you mentioned about, being content-specific and culture-specific, and I think, this is the time for AI you said, oh, developers won't think about it, so, the deployers must think about it. This is the time for Southeast Asian developers as well to say, well, what can we do to basically offer more to the rest of the world? And I want to just give an example of a digital product which is built in Southeast Asia for Southeast Asia, and Grab Maps, for example. Most of you may have taken a Grab, maybe you took a Grab to come here, but underlying, we all know that it's based on geospatial data that can deliver a car to you, etc. So, but we also know in Southeast Asia, roads are a kind of very flexible term, right? To get from A to B, maybe you take a road, maybe you take a little unmarked way, maybe there is a little underground way, maybe there's a little ferry or a bridge which is not unmarked. And in Indonesia, they call these jalan tikus, which are rat alleys. And these roads are sometimes so small that a motorbike can just fit through, right? And so these routes don't show up in maps that often rely on satellite data or on car-mounted, sorry Rachel, I know a lot of your maps are car-mounted cams. The cars don't even get there. So what does Southeast Asia look like, right? Geospatial data is absolutely essential. So Grab partnered with their merchants, with their driver partners, and the delivery partners to aggregate data on a community-based model. And then they used AI to cleanse and process this data to be able to build a digital map. And these, of course, right, this helps Grab's business, but it also puts it back into the ecosystem. So about 800,000 kilometers of unmarked roads are now back into OpenStreetMap, which is an open source database. And so what does that mean is that now Grab Maps, okay, helps Grab, that's great. But Grab Maps also powers Amazon Web Services location service solution. And what that means is that organizations which are not even customers of Grab, they're customers of AWS, and these are e-commerce companies, transportation companies, even governments, emergency services, for example, can use this solution to improve their location-based services in Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, number one, the data set's super important, right? How you train, which Rachel said, she is a doctor, right? How you train is also super important, and how you test. how do you consider diversity from the very outset at every step of building the model or deploying the product is super important. If we are able to do that, then we can have products which are fit for purpose to serve the communities that these products are supposed to serve.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, if you want to take a seat, there are seats towards the front. Please come grab a chair. And we're going to turn to the audience participation section of today's discussion. Some great questions have come in. But just while I get ready for the first question, I'm having an idea for a startup. If anyone wants to go into a venture on putting GoPros on rats to map the byways of Southeast Asia with me, meet me after the session. Okay, so you can vote. Not only can you put up a question, you can vote for your favorite question. The one that got the most votes is a very topical one, which is in an age of Gen AI, what kind of changes might generative AI require in the regulatory environment in order to address two key challenges? And I'll maybe start with 1C. And one is intellectual property protection. I did something for the Straits Times recently about this. There's a whole set of questions about how generative AI scoops up or scrapes up data, often pirated data, which seems pretty much to be theft, but also copyrighted data, which may or may not be fair use. There's a lot of litigation about this. And there's also an interesting question about who owns it afterwards. It also raises the challenge that I think Rachel touched on earlier of generative AI creating ever greater volumes of ever more realistic looking material that's nonetheless fake. So 1C, in 30 seconds, or no, just some preliminary responses, the kind of posture that you think a government like Singapore might take in addressing these kinds of challenges, and then maybe I'll come to Rachel as well on the same question.
I think maybe the way to answer that question is to then say what has changed, right? Like you said, in what has changed in Gen AI that was different from last year, for example, before it became really popular. And definitely, I think that idea of how then do we make sure that value is attributed to the owners of copyrighted content, for example, is done properly. Those are things that we have to think about. And certainly, I think from the legal perspective, we will have to think about how then do we, or legislation perspective, how then do we update or clarify? But mostly maybe clarify. I think Singapore's laws are okay for now. Clarify our legislation to make sure that people understand. So what has changed really is number one, training data is being used in the scale that has never been used in the past, right? Two, so many more people are sort of using it today, using these Gen AI products and services today. And three, so many more people are impacted, right? And then because of that, then we have to start reviewing what are the changes that we need to do with legislation. Definitely on the personal data protection front, which is I think I'm a little bit more comfortable to speak to than IP. There'll be some clarifications coming out from PDBC about the use of personal data for training and the use of personal data in prompts and then addressing it in output as well. And as well then in deepfakes, right? And that was, I think, the question about generated images, and then how does the government think about making sure that this is authentic? It's a very, very, very complex problem, right? Not just from a technology perspective, and that is really arms race, right? As much as you can put in place the capability to watermark, to detect, and so on, there will be bad actors who put in the capability to create frauds and so on. So that's one on the technical side, an arms race. And then there is on the other end, right? Then there is the users. I mean, we talked about, just before this, we were talking about users and having them be aware of making that distinction. And what are the tools and other abilities or capabilities that we need to put in place for the users to learn to discern better. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones who will be circulating the images, who will be changing their minds when they see an image, right? And that will impact a lot of downstream concerns like elections and so on. And I'm just highlighting two extremes. That in between, there are a lot of other actors as well that we have to worry about. But these are two ways in which we have to then think about the authenticity of generated images and how then do we make sure that that doesn't become a problem of people then mistrusting everything because they can't tell what's real and what's wrong anymore.
Yeah, that's the prospect of a zero trust environment, which there's a question about education I might come back to later, but Rachel, please.
Thanks, Simon. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to give three quick bites, if you will, of kind of, and going off 1Z's earlier point. I think the piece around deepfakes, misinformation, and the need for watermarking techniques is a topic that we interrogate very seriously internally. Google DeepMind, our research organization, has come up with watermarking tools for images called SynthID, SYNTHID, that we hope to sort of make more apparent and proliferate across Google-generated AI. And obviously these are invisible watermarks on images. We interrogate also very much how we would watermark text. It's a very non-trivial problem, to be really honest. But so not only is it about discerning what is generated, but also the fact that if large language models continue to be trained on generated things, it leads to what we call model collapse, where it basically gets fed this unending loop of self-generated data. So we must, for the sake of the model, but also for the sake of humanity, make sure that we watermark correctly. That's one. The second piece, which speaks to copyright and value attributed to the creators of content, I think it's a very, very important question, and we continue to wrestle with that very much. Simon, you and I have had long chats about this as well, around the value that goes to the creators of that content, but also making sure that creators of content have opt-out choices, which we have introduced so that you can, when you create something, you can say, I want this to be crawled on Google search, but not to go into any form of LLM and training. So I think that's a very important set of choices that we now put to content creators. And the last piece is around origin, right? So for instance, for Bard, we give the ability for when a generated piece of answers come out, you can Google for source to verify on your own whether there is veracity behind what the tool is spitting out that counters hallucinations and so on. So we want to make sure that we empower people who use our generative AI tools to be able to go to source. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more, but just three.
Yeah, maybe just 2 points following on from what you said. I mean, in terms of generative AI and the possibility of misuse, I still think, as the token academic on the panel, it's kind of quaint that people like me around the world, when ChatGPT was released, there was much hand-wringing on academic Twitter saying, oh my goodness, this transformative technology might mean my students might cheat in their research papers, when clearly it's got much bigger consequences than that. In terms of the IP point, just one nuance to add to what 1C and Rachel have said, is that Singapore in 2021 introduced a computational data analysis or a text and data mining exception to copyright, which enables, because Singapore wanted to be friendly to data mining, wanted to encourage that, and that was to encourage data mining, which is meant to encourage machine learning. The question is whether producing competing content falls within that exception. And there's actually an interesting case study from Google. Google, around 2002, started copying the world's books. And initially, authors were outraged. How dare you copy my book? But in the end, it was resolved because what people realized is this was not competing with the original books, because you couldn't read an entire book on Google Books outside of limited exceptions. What it was doing was meaning you would get greater access to them. You could read a snippet, and actually that could potentially increase interest. So that's, I think, a good use of data mining. And that's what we're still trying to work out, along with these kind of behavioral questions like how people will interact with the chatbots. And I think Google, among others, has very interesting experiments in giving people information that hopefully will enable them to understand the context of an answer and how much trust to put in it. And I think those sort of color codings are really interesting experiments underway. Okay, we've got a lot more questions. We're not going to get through them all, but maybe to pick on two. I'll sort of group them into categories of Singapore's international opportunities and safety. And so there are a couple of questions about Singapore's US, the recent agreement with the United States, and whether you could say anything about opportunities that might give rise to within Singapore. And then secondly, there's a question about what kind of safety nets do we need in this environment, what kind of educational tools, and maybe Rachel and then Ming, if you want to talk about the sort of safety context, how we educate people to use these new tools responsibly. Because really, if it was just a matter of, for example, autonomous vehicles plying the road with other autonomous vehicles, that'd be very easy. The challenge is autonomous vehicles interacting with humans or understanding how humans are going to use these new tools. So 1C on the Singapore-US, and then Rachel and Ming on safety.
Okay, so I think Singapore is small, right? I mean, in the world. So I think for a lot of things that we do, we want to make sure that there are global norms, global rules of the road that all countries will adhere to. Otherwise, it'll be just a few big countries imposing their rules on the rest of the world, right? So just like in AI governance, we do want to make sure that there's no fragmentation, that Singapore's point of view about how we should govern AI is something that can be recognized by other countries around the world as well. I mean, recognized in a way that they understand us, they will work with us, we minimize, like I said, fragmentation, there's greater alignment and interoperability and so on. And we do that bilaterally with countries, we do that at multilateral platforms, like the OECD, like the Global Partnership for AI and so on. And then specifically then with the US, quite recently we had the cooperation on emerging technologies dialogue that happened. And that's where we started talking about then how do we work with the US. US is a big partner, right? That it's important that they understand also how Singapore thinks about things and how can we contribute also to influencing some of the ideas that is coming out from the US. The recent executive order lay out quite a lot of different things that the US plans to do in the space of AI governance. And I think there are definitely opportunities where through the CET platform, we can partner and provide, based on the way, because we can move faster, we are small. So based on the way we move, we run, the projects that we do, we can provide some ideas as to how we could benefit or how we could shape some of these developments. And one of them, one of the things that we did with US was we mapped AI Verify with the National Institute of Science and Technologies, AI RMF. RMF stands for Risk Management System. And we showed how this can be aligned. And from there, we then understand each other better. And then moving forward, that's where we can do more of such collaboration with the US, especially in the Gen AI space. And we'll do the same with other bilateral partners as well. And maybe I'll stop here because I think it's a complex topic. And I'm happy also to hear if anybody after this session would like to discuss a bit more about where we can work better with our global partners. Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe Ming and then Rachel on safety and education.
Okay, maybe I'll broaden it from safety to responsibility, yeah? And I think when we go around to all of the different countries, every government is very much focused on how do I invest in digital capability? How do I invest in AI capability? And they're always thinking about training more data scientists, training more people in computer vision or in natural language processing. But I'm an engineer who ended up with a PhD in history, right? So you think you really need to also understand that engineers are human and that they're also serving humans. And AI is effectively a delegation of work that was traditionally the domain of humans, which is cognitive work, to machines. And how do we recognize that? So when you think about education, we have some universities to say, we're going back to pen and paper tests, and we're going to say, ignore the AI and try to keep it out of our world, and that just isn't going to work. And then you also have engineering schools to say, well, we'd be disappointed if our kids weren't using AI, right? But we're not going to grade the paper, we're going to grade how they defend the paper, right? So that you, at the end of the day, are accountable for whatever you decide to do. So I think that when it comes to those that question about how can educators raise awareness of AI literacy and preparedness. AI literacy and preparedness, the same with cybersecurity, same with digital literacy. Number one is it is a means to be able to use a richer set of tools out there. We can read not because we want our ABCs, but because it opens up the world of the written word to us. And so we want to build not AI literacy as an ends, but as a means to an ends to be able to make this world inclusive to all of us. I think Singapore does it pretty well, primarily because IMDA does not try and do it all by itself, right? One of the biggest partners in understanding misinformation, understanding disinformation is the library system. And to be able to work with partners who are already out there in the community, don't let the techies do the community work, let the community people do the community work, but have shared outcomes at the end of the day on a safe and responsible use of AI.
Thanks. I can certainly tell you at the National University of Singapore in the School of Computing, there are some subjects where they have to use generative AI for coding because it would be irrational and inefficient to do it yourself. So Rachel, we're running out of time. There was someone asking you to trash talk competitors. I won't ask you to do that. But could you talk a bit about how we should think about safety and education in this context?
And Ming, I'm so grateful that you brought up the human-centric piece. So I'm going to answer this question in two, sort of one corporate hat and then one in like a hat as a mother of two young kids growing up in what would presumably be the AI native future. So in the corporate hat, I think that fundamental elements around AI need to start coming through in Google Career Certificates, which are our reskilling programs, for example. I mean, these are all my talking points around what we do to make it scalable and accessible to all people who want to transit, right? Get the basics of AI and ML and reskill no matter where you are in your career. There's an element also around embedding AI in our online safety curricula for younger kids so that they can continue to have powers of discernment. But I think what speaks to me more deeply as a human and mom here is for our kids to grow up in a world that remembers ultimately the capabilities of human nature. That includes things like relationship, collaboration, working through conflict, things that are fundamentally human that an AI companion can never replace. Critical thinking, for example. And that would be my call to all of us so that we can build AI into not replacing ultimately what is uniquely human about us, and to engage in that dialogue around how all these pieces fit together. So I might end on a slightly emo note, but back to you, Simon.
All right, well, I think the organisers said it's a pretty challenging task of solving AI and governance in 50 minutes. We haven't solved it completely, but maybe we've taken a couple of steps. There are lots more questions, but I always think as moderator, it's better to leave the audience wanting more than wanting less. So I'll stop here and just ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, panelists. Do step to the front of the stage for a photo-taking session.
Yes, because unless it was on social media, it never happened, so we're going to pose for photos now.
Yes, precisely. The session is ongoing, and next up,